Hello, I'm Bernadine Lennon, a member of the Greene-Dreher Historical Society, where I serve on the board of directors. The Historical Society is located in South Sterling, Dreher Township, Wayne County, which is situated in northeastern Pennsylvania. Now, throughout the presentation today, I will be referring to the Greene-Dreher community. For over 200 years, residents of the community have shared a common history, they've intermarried, and they've organized for the betterment of their neighbors. When the German settlers arrived here in the 1820s, they purchased land on either side of the Wallenpaupack Creek, and their land ran west into Dreher Township, Wayne County, and east into Greene Township, Pike County. And since then, the residents have organized with names such as the Greene-Dreher Volunteer Fire Company, the Greene-Dreher Sterling Fair, the Greene-Dreher High School, and the Greene-Dreher Alumni Association, and most recently, the Greene-Dreher Historical Society. Now, on behalf of the Greene-Dreher Historical Society, I researched the biographies of 142 men and women who served during World War I and who had ties to the Greene and Dreher community. And the culmination of which all this research produced was the book Greene-Dreher in the Great War. Now, during the presentation, I'll be highlighting resources I used in researching these veterans and which may be of use to you. I'll also discuss little known facts, at least they were little known to me, and the Army within the Army, which I discovered while conducting research for the book. World War I was a pivotal clash that forever changed the world. Empires collapsed. No longer was there a Russian Empire, an Ottoman Empire, or an Austro-Hungarian Empire. Maps of the Middle East and Africa were redrawn, and new nations were born: Poland, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Ukraine, and many others. Conflicts after the war, such as World War II and the Cold War, were rooted in the peace treaty which followed the war. Additionally, many of the conflicts today that we see, such as in the Middle East, have their history in World War I. There were many innovations in the war, some of them very good on the medical side. And these innovations in medical technology and treatment increased the survival rate of soldiers. And of course, then they transferred this technology to civilians after the war. There was also technology developed directly to support the military, either offensively or defensively. And finally, daylight savings time was introduced when Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire changed to daylight savings time. In April of 1916, in order to reduce reduce the use of artificial lighting, and as a result, they could save their total reserves of coal for the war effort. And the United States followed suit in 1918. So what brought about this World War, the Great War, in which tens of millions of military and civilian lives were lost? The war had been raging on the European continent since 1914, when on June 28th of that year, a Serbian nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife in Sarajevo. The Archduke was heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The empire declared war on Serbia 1 month later, effectively beginning the First World War on July 28, 1914. Now, because of mutual defense alliances among the European nations, 10 nations were at war within 30 days. As the war progressed over the next 2.5 years, more nations joined the war, but it became a stalemate and neither side was gaining ground. The United States remained neutral militarily, though it did provide humanitarian relief and supplies. However, as the war dragged on, German unrestricted submarine warfare against the United States passenger and commercial shipping, and the discovery of the Zimmermann telegram brought America into the war on the side of Britain and France on April 6, 1917. Now, the Zimmermann telegram was a secret diplomatic communication issued by the German Foreign Office. In January 1917, it proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico. In the event the United States entered World War I against Germany, Mexico would recover Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. The telegram was intercepted and decoded by British intelligence and passed to the Americans. Revelation of the contents enraged Americans. Congress declared war on Germany on April 6, 1917, and the first American-led troops arrived in France in June 1917. There had not been a war like this, and for many years it was referred to as the Great War. More men fought in it, and more countries from all over the globe were engaged in it than in any other war. There were more military and civilian deaths than in prior wars. Women in Pennsylvania worked on farms and in factories to replace men called to military service. They formed the backbone of the American Red Cross, which was small and loosely organized before the war, but grew to include hundreds of thousands of women and men in Pennsylvania. The American Red Cross, the YMCA, and other humanitarian organizations helped not only soldiers, but also their families at home. These organizations went to France and were among those who were wounded in action and decorated for heroism. The majority of Pennsylvanians who served in the Army during the First World War were assigned to the 28th, 79th, and 80th Divisions. African Americans from Pennsylvania served in the 92nd and 93rd Divisions, as the armed services were racially segregated, as was most of American society. Formed initially from Pennsylvania National Guard units, the 28th Division was engaged with the enemy beginning in late June 1918 through November 11th of that year. The 79th Division was one of 16 National Army divisions of draftees authorized under the National Defense Act of May 18, 1917. But it retained a substantial number of men from Philadelphia and eastern Pennsylvania. The 79th was engaged with the enemy from September 1918 to the armistice. The 80th Division originally consisted of men mostly drafted from western Pennsylvania, Virginia, and West Virginia. The division, also a National Army division, was engaged with the enemy beginning late August 1918 and continued through the armistice. All three of these divisions fought in the largest and costliest battle ever fought by the armed forces of the United States, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, which spanned 49 days and eventually drew in 1.2 million American troops, taking the lives of over 26,000 of them and wounding another 96,000, most of them within a period of about 3 weeks of heavy fighting. On March 19, 1917, the Navy became the first branch of the U.S. Armed Forces to allow women to enlist in a non-nursing capacity. 2 days later, Miss Loretta Walsh of Philadelphia, who was 21 years of age, was the first woman to enlist in the United States Navy under this new rule. From the outbreak of the First World War in Europe in 1914, Pittsburgh and Philadelphia industrial centers played important roles in the war effort, even though the United States was at first a neutral country. Pennsylvania manufacturing, agriculture, mining, steelmaking, hospitals, and transportation facilities contributed importantly to the war effort. After the war, Pennsylvania erected the Pennsylvania State Memorial at Varennes, France, in honor of those who served in the Great War. The state also erected a memorial to the 80th Division in Nantillois, France, when at full strength, the 80th Division consisted of 23,000 men, mostly from Pennsylvania, Virginia, and West Virginia, and was nicknamed the Blue Ridge Division. It was known to never have failed to gain its objective and was the only American Expeditionary Forces division called upon 3 times in the Great Meuse-Argonne Offensive. It captured 2 German soldiers for every one of its men who was wounded. The division suffered 17,000 casualties. As I mentioned earlier, I wrote the biographies for 142 men and women who served in the war. Before I began to research, I asked myself the question, where do I begin? The person I'm researching is dead, and in most cases, if not all, their children, spouses, and siblings are deceased. If I was lucky, I might be able to find a grandchild. Well, I began in our local cemeteries searching for American flags which mark the graves of veterans. Some flags also mark the graves of firefighters and policemen, but for the most part, these flags represented the graves of veterans. As I collected the names of the veterans and sorted them by the wars they fought in, I was able to glean some information about their time in the military from their grave markers. If I was lucky, their rank, branch of military service, and the war they served in would be on the grave marker. From the names I gathered, I used the above resources extensively to learn more about the service member. Most of this research was using Ancestry.com, findagrave.com, and newspapers.com. If you don't have access to those tools on the internet, your local library may have a subscription to Ancestry.com and internet access for its patrons. You can also request military history books from your local library using interlibrary loan. The National Archives and Records Administration holds many of these sources of information, and you can request a service member's military record from them. Now, I want to walk you through these sources of information, which I will give you a fairly good snapshot of the veteran service. You will not be able to find all information for all veterans, but I will give you an example of my research for Private First Class Ralph Williams, for whom I was able to locate most information. He is not included in the book I wrote because he lived in neighboring Palmyra Township, Pike County. However, he is an excellent example of what you can find if you're lucky. The Selective Service Act of 1917 authorized the United States government to raise a national army by conscription, also known as the draft. There had been only one draft prior to this, and that was for the Civil War. Unlike the Civil War, the World War I draft did not permit a draftee to pay someone to take his place. There were 3 draft registration dates during the war. June 5th, 1917, men between the ages of 21 and 30 registered. On June 5th the following year, men who became 21 after June 5th, 1917 registered. And on September 12th, 1918, men between the ages of 18 and 45 registered for the draft. Ralph's draft card documents his birth date, place of birth, occupation, marital status, whether he claimed exemption from military service, and his physical description. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania paid honorably discharged veterans and those still in service a bonus compensation of $10 for every month served during the war. Veterans of the war were asked to complete the Veterans Compensation Application Form in 1934. The information on the form is useful if you want to request the service member's military record from the National Archives and Records Administration. On the application, you can find important information that will help in further research. For example, the service member's serial number is noted on the first line. That information, along with date and location of birth, is useful when requesting the service member's military record from the National Archives. While this detailed information is available for most Pennsylvania veterans, similar forms are not available if the veteran entered the military from another state, since not all states had a similar form. You would need to contact that state's archives in order to find out whether there was a veterans compensation application form. Veterans could also apply for a World War I Victory Medal following the war. The application for the medal documents the service member's serial number, the unit he was assigned to, and major military operations the service member participated in. On the medal itself, these military operations would be indicated with battle clasps. Much of this information is also on the veterans compensation form, but may be more accurate on the application for the Victory Medal, since this application was prepared in 1920, as opposed to the veterans compensation application form, which was prepared 14 years later. The War Service Record was a survey completed by World War I veterans in 1920 for the Pennsylvania War History Commission. However, because it was a voluntary effort, not all veterans completed the survey. The Pennsylvania War History Commission was formed in 1918, after the war. Its purpose was to preserve the record of every Pennsylvanian who served in the military or performed welfare work during the war. Included in the record was to be a photograph of each man, a record of his life prior to enlistment, a record of his military career, along with copies of letters or newspaper articles regarding his service. The War Service Record is unique to Pennsylvania, but some states may have had something similar. If the veteran you're researching enlisted from another state, you would need to contact that state's archives for information. Death certificates for Pennsylvanians who died through 1968 are available to the public and can provide information concerning the service member who died in Pennsylvania. Now, that date of 1968 is as of 2020, and the state releases death certificates periodically after 1968. If it falls within the period of time, the information can be released. Other states have different release dates, and the Pennsylvania Bureau of Vital Statistics is the repository of death certificates and can let you know whether or not the death certificate you're interested in is releasable. Ralph's death certificate records that he was a veteran and served in World War I. His dates of birth and death and his parents' names and cemetery where he is interred are recorded. Once the date of death is known, additional information can be gleaned from obituaries. If the executor's name is known, then it's possible to contact that person or their descendants for information. The 1930 federal census asked whether the individual served during a war. Veterans of both the Spanish-American War and World War I who were alive in 1930 recorded this information in the second to the last column on the census form. And you'll note on this form that Ralph Williams is listed near the bottom of the form, and to the right, the second column from the end says that he served in WW, which stands for World War. Many combat divisions during the war recorded their histories, and the histories were primarily written by someone who served in the division during the war. And if you're lucky, the veteran's specific unit would be mentioned in the history, as in the case of the 311th Machine Gun Battalion, which Ralph was assigned to. Your local library may be able to assist you in obtaining these histories through interlibrary loan. Ralph's grave is located in Pine Grove Cemetery in Paupack, Palmyra Township, Pike County. His marker shows the division, battalion, and company he served in. He was a private first class and served in World War I. The dates of his birth and death are indicated. If you don't know where the person is interred, his death certificate will record that information. If the veteran's next of kin applied for a bronze grave marker, the request would be on file with the Veterans Administration, but probably can also be accessed using Ancestry.com. This is an image of what you can see if you're able to locate the grave on the website Find a Grave. Sometimes someone will post the person's obituary, and if they were married, the spouse's name and children, if they were interred in the cemetery as the veteran. Now you can request a veteran's military record from the National Archives and Records Administration by using standard form 180. A fee is charged once the staff there determines the number of pages. The form asks for the information we already found on other sources, such as birth and death dates, branch of military service, serial number, whether the veteran was an officer or enlisted, dates of service, and so on. The military record can provide additional information to fill in details you're missing. Now, I have used the services of a private researcher when I'm unable to continue researching. For example, if research materials are held at the National Archives in St. Louis, if I'm looking for specific records at the archives, I might hire a researcher to locate those specific records. And because of their experience, they might have other sources to tap that I wouldn't know about. If your ancestor left a paper trail to any degree, you can probably locate documents on these two websites. They are subscription-based. Many of the documents I've shown you in this presentation came from one of these two websites. Most libraries offer access to them to their patrons. Now, this is the family tree I found on Ancestry.com for Ralph, and it gives his dates of birth and death, as well as those of his family members. Sometimes it will include photographs of family members and copies of documents that are relevant. The trees normally provide contact information for the person who posted the family tree, and I was able to get photographs and additional information concerning the veteran by contacting the person who posted the family tree. In summary, these are the sources you can use in researching a veteran of the Great War. Now, some of these sources can be used for researching any person, regardless of whether they served in the military. For example, the draft card was filled out by all men between the certain ages that I mentioned. And if they did not serve in the war, the draft card would still indicate his birth date, his residence, his whether or not he was married, and his occupation. The death certificate would provide information about the person regarding his birth place and birth date, his parents' names. Military personnel records are open to the public 62 years after the person leaves military service, and records of any veteran who separated from the military 62 or more years ago can be ordered from the National Archives and Records Administration. Records of individuals who left service less than 62 years ago are subject to access restrictions, and only limited information or copies may be released to the general public within the provisions of the Freedom of Information Act and the Privacy Act, which balance the right of the public to obtain information from the military service records and the right of the former military service member to protect his or right privacy. I might add one other information for veterans who served in World War II. They also completed a veterans compensation form if they enlisted from Pennsylvania. This application doesn't give quite as much information as the application for World War I veterans, but it's another source of information if the person you're researching enlisted from Pennsylvania. So given this, these resources of information, what have we learned about Ralph Williams and his service during the war? Well, he was the son of Charles and Lucy Kellum Williams, who lived in Paupack, Elmira Township, Pike County. He was 27 years old, working on the family farm when he was inducted in the Army at Milford on November 2nd, 1917. He had brown hair and was of medium height. He was assigned to the 79th Division, which trained at Camp Meade, Maryland. Ralph was promoted to private first class prior to deploying to France in June of 1918. And he was designated a machine gunner with Company C of the 311th Machine Gun Battalion. Histories of the 79th Division provide details from the day the division was organized, with draftees primarily from Pennsylvania and Maryland, until the war ended. After a year of training, the division sailed overseas in June 1918. The division saw extensive combat in the Meuse-Argonne offensive area, where it earned the name of Cross of Lorraine for its defense of France. Though the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, Ralph and the men of the 79th Division remained in France until June 1919. The soldiers were offered vocational training in carpentry, horseshoeing, and farming to assist them with their reintegration to civilian life. The regiment moved fresh horses to the Army of Occupation in Germany and returned with horses that were weak from exhaustion and convalescing from gas poisoning. The division returned to the United States in May 1919. Throughout its entire World War I work, the division suffered 6,800 casualties, 1,151 killed, and 5,700 wounded. Private Henry Gunther, the last American soldier to be killed during action in World War I, served in the 79th Division. Fortunately, Ralph was not injured or wounded during the war, and for his service, he received the World War I Victory Medal with battle clasps for the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Now, this letter was written by Ralph Williams describing a machine gunner's life in the late war. Ralph submitted the letter in a contest sponsored by the Philadelphia Record. He won second prize of $75 in the contest. The letter was printed in May 11th, 1919 edition of the paper. It is a 37,000-word letter. The Army recognized that it made a big difference to their soldiers to be able to write home and receive letters along with parcels containing food, tobacco, and extra clothing. In the course of the war, millions of soldiers sent billions of letters home. In almost all cases, these letters were censored by the Army to make sure that no information was given to the enemy. Military censors took samples of these letters to the generals in order to provide a picture of what their soldiers were thinking and the level of their morale. The government encouraged family members who received letters from their loved ones to have the letters published in hometown newspapers. Only letters written by soldiers expressing support for their country in the war were printed in the newspapers in order to keep up support of the war at home. Now, Private Williams was one of the fortunate men who served in the war, and he did not die or was he wounded or injured. However, for soldiers who died on the battlefield or from wounds or disease in Europe, the Army's Grave Registration Service was responsible for disposition of the remains. Shortly after the United States entered the war, the Graves Registration Service under the U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps created 4 grave registration units that were deployed to Europe during the war. Units of the Grave Registration Service were attached to each division in action and made every effort during the period of active fighting to follow up the advance quickly in order to identify and register the dead, moving them from isolated and shallow graves to specially dedicated cemeteries in the rear. They documented eyewitness accounts of the soldiers' death. The work of the Graves Registration Service continued until the summer of 1919. American dead were buried in approximately 2,400 locations in Europe. Provisions were made for permanent burials according to the wishes of the next of kin. Although bodies of service members had been returned to the United States after the Spanish-American War, military leaders resisted doing this for those who died in World War I because of the difficulty and cost involved. Soldiers' bodies were not returned to the United States until after hostilities had ceased. This relieved the Army of needing to transport embalming supplies, caskets, and embalmers to Europe on transport ships. This left room for essential supplies needed to win the war on the ships. Following the War Department surveyed each of the fallen soldiers' next of kin to determine whether they would like the body to be brought back to the United States for final burial in a family plot, a non-military cemetery, or a national cemetery such as Arlington, or whether the family wanted the body to remain in Europe and be interred in one of 8 American military cemeteries in Europe. The remains of 46,000 soldiers were returned to the United States at their families' request. The remaining 30,921 American war dead were laid to rest in one of 7 military cemeteries located in France and Belgium near major battle sites and an 8th cemetery in England. In 1923, Congress enacted legislation establishing the American Battle and Monuments Commission. This commission was responsible for the administration, operation, and maintenance of American cemeteries and monuments on foreign soil. The graves of the 30,921 American service dead who remained in Europe are maintained by the commission. In 1929, the government arranged for pilgrimages to the European cemeteries by mothers and widows of members of military and naval forces of the United States who died during the war. By October 31st, 1933, when the project ended, 6,693 women had made the pilgrimage. Now, if the veteran you're researching is interred in one of the American military cemeteries located overseas, the American Battle Monuments Commission can assist in locating the veteran's grave and, upon request, provide an image of the service member's grave marker. Such is the case for Private First Class Sidney Bartleson, who was born in Newfoundland and who died during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in World War I. His biography and military service are in Greene-Dreher in the Great War. Now these humanitarian aid agencies that are mentioned on this slide were formed because the military focus was on the training, clothing, and equipping new recruits. Whether they had access to religious services, recreational activities, libraries, and educational opportunities was not a priority. However, General Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, knew that these factors were important to the soldiers' morale. The morale was really the fourth factor for the soldier, in addition to training, clothing, and equipping. General Pershing didn't have the resources to spare to organize and provide for these activities. So the 130 relief and humanitarian organizations stepped in to fill the void. They were the Army within the Army. The US-based Commission for Relief in Belgium and Northern France alone fed 9 million people daily. Welfare organizations provide social, recreational, education, and religious activities lacking at training camps and military units at the time. Now, these 7 humanitarian organizations provided tens of thousands of workers at home and overseas to support troops through their welfare programs. Many of their workers were wounded, contracted Spanish influenza, and died. And I'm going to discuss the work of the American Red Cross and the YMCA in a bit in more detail. The YMCA worked to provide for the morale and well-being of military and their families. They built 4,000 huts for religious and education purposes and 1,500 canteens. They operated 44 factories in Europe, which produced cookies and candies for service members. Pennsylvania provided the second largest number of YMCA workers for the war. 250 YMCA workers, or centers rather, opened in Great Britain within 2 weeks of the start of World War I in 1914. Lessons learned from the Y's work in Great Britain provided a template for its work with the US military. YMCA huts, such as the one located in the bottom left of the screen, were gathering places for soldiers and took the place of home, school, social club, church. In cities, they could be a large private dwelling, or overseas a French chateau converted for YMCA use as a hut. On the front lines, it could have been nothing more than a half-demolished building, a barn, a cellar, or a dugout, as noted in the pictures on the right side of the screen. YMCA exchanges offered such things as refreshments, snacks, reading material, and toiletries. The American YMCA expanded work to provide welfare to soldiers held in POW camps, regardless of whether they were in camps for Allied or enemy purposes. YMCA workers met the new enlistee at home. They rode with them on troop trains. They offered refreshments at railway stations, as the 5 women seen in the upper left-hand portion of the slide. They offered sandwiches and coffee and donuts to the troops. YMCA workers offered religious education and entertainment services at training camps. They accompanied them on troop ship transports to France, served with the American Expeditionary Forces at the front lines, and established rest and relaxation facilities and entertainment for the soldiers. The University of Minnesota holds the YMCA archives, and the archives includes images, personnel files, and documents relating to the work of the YMCA during World War I. Now, Charles was born in La Anna, Greene Township, Pike County, Pennsylvania, and he attended local schools, the Scranton Business School, Wyoming Seminary, located in Kingston, and graduated from Syracuse University, where he served as a YMCA secretary. Being too old to serve in the military, Charles served as a YMCA secretary during the war. Now, a YMCA secretary is not someone who types, files, or writes letters, but rather the secretary was the director of a YMCA program and organized services offered by the YMCA. During World War I, YMCA workers supported the new enlistee from the time he left home, when the worker would explain to the new enlistee what to expect, riding on the troop trains and at training camps, and remained with the soldier until he returned home from the war. They boarded troop trains carrying recruits to training bases, providing food and refreshment aboard the trains. At training camps, they managed the YMCA huts and canteens, offering food, snacks, leisure items, as well as entertainment, religious services, and literacy classes. The YMCA worker accompanied the Army on troop ships sailing to France, organizing shipboard recreational activities, and providing reading material and stationery to the soldiers. Once overseas, the YMCA worker managed rest and relaxation facilities and accompanied troops to the front line, setting up YMCA huts where they offered hot chocolate and donuts and assisted in first aid treatment. Now, as I mentioned, while at Syracuse University, Charles was active in the YMCA and served as general secretary. Following graduation, he served as secretary for the YMCA in New York City, where he raised funds for the work of the Y. Beginning in January 1918, Charles served with the French Army as a YMCA secretary for 4 months, and then he was transferred to the Italian Army, where he served as a YMCA secretary for the remainder of the war. He served with the 8th Italian Army in the final battle, defeating the Austro-Hungarian Army at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. He remained in Italy after the war as part of the YMCA reconstruction work in the city of Rome. For his service, Charles was awarded the Italian War Cross, which was awarded to military and civilian personnel for exceptional valor in the face of the enemy. He was also given the Bronze Medal by the city of Rome for his reconstruction work after the war. Now, when we talk about an army within an army, just take a look at these numbers for the American Red Cross and how it grew from 1914 to 1918. The American Red Cross recruited more than 22,000 professionally trained nurses to serve in the U.S. Army Nurse Corps, and over 10,000 of these served near the Western Front. Another 1,500 nurses served in the U.S. Navy. American Red Cross nurses also worked in American units attached to the British and French armies before the United States entered the war. They established 6 base hospitals with the British Expeditionary Forces, and then in October 1917, they began serving with the American Expeditionary Forces. A campaign to recruit nurses began in early December 1917. In less than 1 month, over 2,000 nurses had responded to the call. Besides providing nurses, the American Red Cross workers, like the YMCA, operated canteens for troops while in transit at railroad stations and ports of embarkation and debarkation, and at 130 locations in France alone, serving Allied and American troops. I've not been able to locate personnel files for the Red Cross workers who served in the war, but the American Red Cross headquarters in Washington, D.C. can provide general information, and there are excellent reference books concerning the work of the American Red Cross during the war. 4 women who served in the war are highlighted in the book I wrote. May Carter was born in Barrett Township, Monroe County, and attended nursing school at Chester County Hospital in Pennsylvania, where she graduated in 1916. She worked at hospitals in Chester County and Philadelphia and was exactly the type of nurse the Red Cross wanted to recruit, a professionally trained nurse with experience. In the fall of 1918, she volunteered to serve overseas with the American Red Cross. Before leaving, she returned to her family, who were now living in Scranton. While there, she contracted Spanish influenza and died from pneumonia on October 5th, 1918. She is interred in Pine Grove Cemetery in South Sterling. What caught my attention when walking through Pine Grove Cemetery looking for veterans' graves was May's grave marker. Next to it was an American flag set in a World War I marker, and her stone grave marker engraved with the symbol of the American Red Cross. The star in the center indicates that she had died while serving. Helen Bortree and her cousins, Lila Heberling and Ida Marsh, graduated from Greene-Dreher High School and served as nurses during World War I. Lila served as a contract nurse with the Army Nurse Corps, and Ida served with the American Red Cross. Helen was one of thousands of nurses who responded to the government's campaign beginning in December 1917 for nurses to join the Army Nurse Corps. Helen and her cousins were one of 250 nurses who joined from the Scranton area. U.S. Army and Navy nurses served without rank or commission. Helen served in stateside hospitals, military hospitals throughout the war, and on an Army transport ship following the war. In 1920, the U.S. Army and Navy recognized its nurses and accorded them ranks up to major. This is when Helen was designated a second lieutenant, and she remained in the Army Nurse Corps until she married in 1932. This letter is an example of the tens of thousands of letters written by nurses to soldiers' relatives during the war. Nurses took the care they provided very personally, as this letter reveals. You can well imagine the relief in some cases, or maybe the sadness in others, of next of kin to receive a letter such as that written by nurse and driver on the slide. But I think it would give next of kin consolation knowing that there was someone by their family member's side at the time of death. During the war, Pennsylvania's sons and daughters served as doctors, nurses, artillerymen, infantrymen, mechanics, messengers, cooks, bakers, aviators, sailors, Marines, humanitarian workers, to name just a few of their wartime duties. They faced fear, loneliness, homesickness, and deadly disease. Some were gassed, wounded, or lost a limb. They were welcomed home, except for the 53,000 men and women who paid the ultimate sacrifice. For many of them, their final resting places is with their fallen comrades in the American cemeteries of France and Belgium and England. It has been said that World War I is the forgotten war, that it has faded from memory, and all World War I veterans and their immediate family have passed away long ago. To honor the men and women who served during the war, the Greene-Dreher Historical Society published the Greene-Dreher in the Great War in 2019. The book documents the lives of 142 men and women, military and civilian, from our community who served. Please contact us for information on how to order the book, and our website contains more information concerning other books that we've published, as well as ordering information. Additional information by the Greene-Dreher Historical Society are listed on our website. A history of the local area, ways to become involved in volunteering are also on the website. I want to thank you for your time in attending this presentation. Certainly, if you have any follow-on questions you would like to pose, contact the Historical Society, or if you have information about a veteran that we have missed in the book, please let us know. Following publication of the book, we did identify 3 additional veterans who served during the war, and we have compiled their biographies as well. So again, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you again.